In January, a man wearing a hat, sunglasses, and 2 scarves entered a private clinic in Waipahu. 48 seconds later, he left the building, and 47-year-old John Tokuhara was found dead inside. Despite the abundance of evidence, surveillance cameras, shell casings at the crime scene, and even the hat left behind by the perpetrator, this case proved to be far more complicated than it first appeared. Determining the killer's identity turned out to be an almost impossible task. Waipahu is a community in Honolulu County, Hawaii, on the island of Oahu. It is located inland from Pearl Harbor, and a sugar plantation once stood there. Today, tens of thousands of people live in the area. Just a few minutes away is picturesque Iwa Beach. On the morning of Thursday, January 13, 2022, the weather in Waipahu was warm and clear. At around 8 a.m., Lily Tokuhara decided to check on her son John. John Tokuhara, 47, had owned and operated his own alternative medicine clinic for nearly 20 years. The previous evening, he had told his mother that he would come over for the dinner she had prepared, but he never arrived. When Lily reached the clinic, she saw her son's white pickup truck parked outside. She entered through the back door, which was open. The front door, which faced Waipahu Depot Street, had not been used for 6 months and was chained shut. As soon as she walked in, Lily saw her son lying on the floor in a pool of blood. He showed no signs of life. She immediately called emergency services, but she was in shock and could not help him. It was already too late. Honolulu police officer John Minter was the first to arrive at the scene. He found a shell casing on the office floor. Later, 2 more shell casings were discovered, one of them beneath John Tokuhara's body. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. John had been shot multiple times. It was a brutal but swift murder. The repeated shots to the face suggested that the crime had been driven by personal resentment. In addition, approximately $4,000 in large bills were found next to John's body. If the killer had known about the money, he was clearly not interested in taking it. The murder appeared personal, although it had been carried out in a cold-blooded and calculated manner. John Tokuhara was not married and had no children. However, he had a very close family and many loyal friends. He was especially close to his mother Lily, and he was a loving uncle to his sister's sons. John loved the ocean and everything connected to it: fishing, surfing, and paddling. After completing his master's degree in Chinese medicine and acupuncture, he founded Tokuhara Acupuncture and Health, which he ran on his own. His friends spoke warmly of him. During the years he lived in Waipahu, he became an important figure in the community. John's murder deeply shocked the entire community. It took investigators some time to piece together the fragments of John Tokuhara's life. Despite numerous conversations with friends and family members, not a single clear suspect emerged. John was a respected man, and no one could suggest a convincing motive for the murder. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline from the evening before his death by examining John's last calls and movements. They found 2 phones on the desk in his office, both belonging to him. One of them was inactive and worked only when connected to Wi-Fi. As it turned out, this phone was used exclusively for playing Pokemon Go. The evening before his death, the app on that phone was opened at around 9 p.m. and was never closed. The phone finally shut down at about 8:45 p.m. when the battery died. It remains unclear whether John had actively been playing for hours or whether he was killed while the game was still open. Lily, John's mother, told investigators that she had last spoken to her son shortly after 6 p.m. He had sent her a message from his main phone to arrange dinner, but he never arrived. After 6:18 p.m., there was no further activity on his main phone. Taking that time frame into account, investigators collected footage from surveillance cameras near the clinic. The video showed a white Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck with Hawaii license plates turning north from Farrington Highway onto Waipahu Depot Street at approximately 3 minutes before 6 p.m. After making several quick turns in the area, the truck disappeared from view. A short time later, at a nearby intersection, a man got out of the vehicle and walked toward the clinic. He was wearing a light-colored hat, dark sunglasses, and a scarf covering his head and neck. He was carrying a brown bag. At 6 p.m. he entered John's office at the exact time the last phone activity was recorded. Only 48 seconds later, the same man left the building. No one else entered or exited the clinic until 8 a.m. the next morning, when Lily arrived. As the white Silverado passed the buildings on Waipahu Depot Street, investigators were able to photograph the front license plate. After image enhancement, the photo revealed that the first 3 characters were letters and the last 3 were numbers. However, the exact plate number still could not be determined. The pickup truck had no distinctive features, and there were no visible items in the truck bed. Even so, the vehicle became the most important lead in the investigation. Investigators began searching for matching Silverado pickups. They identified 53 white, 4-door vehicles, likely model years 2014 to 2016, registered in Hawaii with license plates matching that pattern. Investigators eliminated 52 of them through photographs, personal inspection, and by verifying the whereabouts of their owners. Only one suspicious pickup remained, registered to a 34-year-old former client of John's named Eric Thompson. Eric, who ran a successful construction company, had gone to John several years earlier for treatment of carpal tunnel syndrome. That was the only known connection between the two men. Eric was married to his childhood sweetheart and was a devoted father to their 3-year-old daughter. He did not appear to be a typical suspect. What possible motive could a young contractor have for killing a man who had once helped relieve his pain? However, when investigators began reviewing the messages on John's main phone, they discovered thousands of them. In a single month alone, there had been more than 5,600. The messages, exchanged between John and Joyce, were extremely explicit. They sent each other nude photographs, videos, and intimate messages. Their romantic relationship had lasted for some time, but it ended abruptly around 7 months before John's death, when Joyce's husband, Eric, discovered the affair. Judging by their correspondence, John was more emotionally invested in the relationship than Joyce was. He was the first to confess his love, and he repeated his feelings over the course of several months, from mid to late July. John tried to persuade Joyce to take the relationship more seriously so that it would not remain just an affair. Joyce, although involved with him, expressed doubts. She told John that she would continue seeing him, but she would not leave her husband. Over time, she became increasingly worried about the secrecy of the affair and the damage it could do to her marriage. In July, she wrote to John that Eric had discovered their relationship. Eric confronted his wife after she secretly left the house late at night while he was away on a business trip. He saw her leaving on the security cameras installed in their home. Joyce confessed to the affair and agreed to end the relationship with John. She and Eric decided to try to repair their marriage. Joyce and Eric Thompson had met at school in Kailua, east of Honolulu, and married on January 14, 2017. The ceremony took place on a neighbor's beach, attended by many friends and family members. The young couple later moved to Kailua, about a 30-minute drive from Waipahu. Together, they experienced important milestones in life: Eric's graduation from the University of Hawaii and the birth of their only child, a daughter, 2 years before John's murder. At first glance, their marriage and family life seemed almost perfect. Ironically, it was their desire to have a child that led Joyce to seek John's help in the first place. A former school teacher had recommended him, saying he might be able to help them. Joyce began seeing John to treat both infertility and back pain. After a difficult miscarriage, she and Eric tried everything in hopes of having another child. At the time, Eric believed John Tokuhara was genuinely helping them. However, after their daughter was born, Joyce continued visiting John, and their relationship, as it turned out, developed into something more. Once these facts became known, both Joyce and Eric fell under suspicion. On the evening of John's murder, Eric Thompson left his home at approximately 5:20 p.m. in a white 2014 Chevrolet Silverado. The truck headed toward the highway. There were not enough cameras along the route from the Thompsons' home in Kailua to John's clinic in Waipahu to reconstruct Eric's movements completely. However, if his Silverado was indeed seen on Depot Street around 6 p.m., then the travel time fit almost perfectly. According to Google Maps, the trip took between 35 and 55 minutes, depending on traffic. If he left home at 5:20 p.m., it would have been entirely possible for his truck to appear in the Waipahu area shortly before 6 p.m. When Eric returned home at 6:47 p.m., investigators suspected that he had taken steps to destroy evidence of the crime. Less than an hour later, cameras captured a fire burning in the backyard of the Thompsons' home. The flames lasted about 5 minutes. Later that same night, Eric left the house again. This time, an object was visible in the bed of his pickup truck that had not been there before: a toolbox. During the search of the Thompsons' home, investigators found no direct evidence that conclusively linked Eric or Joyce to the murder. Instead, indirect evidence accumulated that could not be ignored. In particular, a wheelbarrow with a bucket in the backyard bore scorch marks, indicating that something had recently been burned there. Police also seized 12 registered firearms belonging to Eric Thompson and found 2 unregistered weapons. 2 of those firearms matched the suspected general type of the murder weapon. However, forensic testing later determined that neither of them was the actual murder weapon, which raised new questions about what had been transported in the back of Eric's truck during the second trip that night. Although more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition were recovered, the final piece of evidence had the power both to strengthen and to weaken the case against Eric Thompson. It was the light-colored hat worn by the suspected killer when he entered and left the clinic. As the shooter crossed the street near the depot, the hat fell to the ground. It remained in the street for about 10 minutes before being picked up by a random passerby. That passerby was eventually located. He was a homeless man who briefly wore the hat until returning to his camp, where he hung it inside his tent and stopped using it. After examining the hat, forensic experts discovered hairs on it. Samples were taken from the inside of the hat, the brim, and the top. The results of the DNA analysis were inconclusive. Eric Thompson could not be excluded as a possible contributor. On February 14, 2022, Eric Thompson was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and illegal use of a firearm in the commission of another crime. He posted $1 million in bail and prepared for trial. When the trial began in July, the prosecution focused mainly on motive, Joyce's affair with John, and on the manner of the killing itself, multiple shots to the head and face, suggesting a murder driven by personal revenge and anger. Prosecutors painted a picture of the ideal life and marriage that Eric believed he once had. They described him as a controlling perfectionist who had worked hard to build a successful business and purchase a $2 million home. When he learned of his wife's affair with John Tokuhara, he forced her to confess to her parents and apologize for her infidelity. The prosecution argued that, in order to reclaim his perfect life, Eric had to remove the man who threatened everything he had built. As long as John remained alive, Eric's world remained shattered, and so, according to the prosecution, he chose to solve that problem by killing him. Prosecutors also claimed that Eric tried to stage circumstances that would help him escape punishment for the murder. According to them, he failed only because of the relentless work of investigators who reviewed countless hours of surveillance footage. When it was Eric's turn to present his case, the seemingly solid narrative began to weaken. Eric stated that he had nothing to do with John Tokuhara's murder and had no intention of seeking revenge for his wife's affair, According to him, he had been shocked and deeply upset, but once he and Joyce agreed to work on their marriage, he no longer had any motive to kill John. He claimed that, although he had burned things in the backyard, they were simply useless items that had accumulated over time, and he had not been destroying evidence. He also said that the toolbox seen in the bed of his truck was an ordinary work item. Meanwhile, the defense tried to undermine the prosecution by raising the issue of other men who might also have had a motive to kill John. After all, according to the defense, he had damaged more than one family through his affairs. The goal was to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. The prosecution, however, insisted that only Eric had a true motive. His life, his marriage, and his carefully planned future had all been shattered. According to the prosecution, that was exactly what pushed him to eliminate John and regain control of his life. At the end of the trial, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution continued to insist that the evidence, although circumstantial, clearly pointed to Eric. They reminded the jury of the surveillance footage of the pickup truck, the timing of the drives, and the hat that could have belonged to him. The defense, on the other hand, focused on other parts of John's personal life to show that Eric was not the only person who might have wanted him dead, and that the case was far less clear-cut than the prosecution claimed. During cross-examination, the prosecution attempted to portray Eric as a man who continued trying to control his wife even after her infidelity. When asked why he was so strongly opposed to Joyce consulting psychics, he compared it to an addiction such as alcoholism, adding that she simply could not stop. The prosecution argued that this was yet another example of how he tried to strip his wife of independence and continued to distrust her despite all her attempts to make amends. Eric also admitted that, despite efforts to repair the relationship after the affair, their marriage still had serious problems. According to him, the prenuptial agreement he signed was proof that Joyce genuinely wanted to restore trust and demonstrate her loyalty. The prosecution, however, interpreted it as pressure from Eric to secure his own position in case another conflict arose. When prosecutors questioned him about the night of the murder, Eric offered explanations for his trips. The first time, he said, he had driven construction safety equipment to the nearest landfill. The second time, he said, he had gone shopping. He insisted that both trips were completely normal and had nothing to do with John's murder. The prosecution, however, pointed out that there was no evidence supporting his story, no receipts, no witnesses, and no surveillance footage to confirm it. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides again laid out their positions. The prosecution focused on Eric's inability to accept that his marriage had broken down, arguing that this emotional collapse drove him to murder. The defense insisted that there was no direct evidence of guilt, and that the statements and evidence presented against Eric were circumstantial and left room for doubt. The final decision rested with the jury, who had to weigh all the arguments and determine whether Eric Thompson was guilty of murdering John Tokuhara. Throughout Eric Thompson's trial, many questions remained unanswered, which led to disagreement among the jurors and ultimately to a mistrial. Judge Paul Wong had to declare the trial unresolved because 9 jurors voted guilty, while 3 believed Eric should be acquitted. One juror later said that the main difficulty was the lack of concrete physical evidence. Many had expected to see something more tangible that would allow them to make a firm decision. But, as he admitted, the case was much more difficult than expected. After the first trial ended without a verdict, the defense expressed hope that the second trial would provide a clearer picture and lead to a more favorable outcome for their client. They emphasized that the impressions initially presented by the media do not always reflect reality and that the jurors had been able to see a much fuller picture in court. After the mistrial, Eric Thompson remained free on bail while awaiting the second trial and tried to continue with his life. However, as the case dragged on, his relationship with Joyce began to unravel. Under public pressure, constant media attention, and the lingering distrust within her family, they could no longer pretend that everything had returned to normal. Joyce, exhausted by the burden of the proceedings, and Eric's constant scrutiny, unexpectedly filed for divorce. Her attorneys then introduced new information, a recording of conversations with a friend in which she expressed doubts about Eric's innocence. These revelations caused a sensation. In those statements, she said that Eric had never truly forgiven her and that his obsession with restoring justice had grown increasingly threatening. Public opinion became divided. Some believed Joyce was trying to save herself and her daughter by shifting the blame onto her husband. Others believed she was a manipulator trying to redirect suspicion. However, under pressure from the new evidence and the growing rumors about Eric's controlling behavior, the prosecutor's office decided to reopen the investigation. Thanks for watching, and stay safe.